Hello, and welcome to this very special program. Over this next hour, we'll be sharing the power of music to honor our military veterans. We'll be hearing the voices of a few service members and veterans speak about how this power brings us all together and what it means to them. I'll share with you some interesting origins of some of this music, and I'll be playing some of that music for you myself. I'm John Hagstrom. I play the trumpet as a member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the sound of the trumpet is at the center of many of the moments that bring us together as a nation. As a leading voice within so much of the music performed by the Chicago Symphony, its powerful sound is also central to the experiences of those who have served our country. I'll be performing on a few historical instruments for you and explaining their connections to the power of military and orchestral music. For the past year, as a CSO member, I've had the honor of holding the Pritzker Military Museum and Library Chair, thanks to a generous gift to the Chicago Symphony from Colonel Jennifer N. Pritzker and the Tawani Foundation. And I'm joining you today from the auditorium of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in downtown Chicago, which is just a few blocks from the CSO's home at Symphony Center. Something else you should know is that I am also a military veteran. Before I joined the CSO in 1996, I was a member of the President's own United States Marine Band in Washington, D.C. for 6 years. There, I performed concerts and ceremonial duties around the country and within the White House as a United States Marine. That experience has made it possible for us to be joined today with the contributions of 3 exemplary current and former Marine Band members: Colonel Jason Fettig, the current director of the Marine Band; Major Ryan Nowlin, currently an assistant director of the Marine Band; and Colonel Timothy Foley, a retired former director of the Marine Band. We'll hear from all of them in the next few minutes, but first let's talk about the trumpet, my favorite subject. The energy you hear that comes from a trumpet or bugle comes actually from the sound of blowing air to vibrate the player's lips into a mouthpiece into the instrument, which amplifies the sound to be heard over great distances when played loudly. And because it's fairly small, it is an instrument that is perfect to be very portable, to withstand the stresses of the battlefield and the orchestra too. So the trumpet is just a long tube. The sound comes from our lips. We blow the air to produce that sound, and it's just wrapped up a few times over. This is a World War I trench bugle. You can see very compact. And it was used to signal over long distances, and someone could carry it with them. And the sound it produces is really just a fanfare. That's what bugle calls are. And a fanfare has a certain effect on us. And I asked Major Ryan Nowlin from the Marine Band to explain what is a fanfare and what does it do? What kind of effect does it have on us? This is what he said.
The beauty of a fanfare is that it makes you anticipate. It gives you something to look forward to, because it's not the fanfare is just another invitation, and it really kind of wets our whistle for what's to come next. And depending on what the fanfare is, anything can follow it. And that piquing of one's curiosity, that invitation to listen and to be open and to be vulnerable for what's going to come next is an essential role of the trumpet.
The sound of the trumpet has such a powerful effect on listeners, and I asked both Major Nowlin and Colonel Fettig to explain more about this power. Here's what they had to say.
The immediate emotional connection that it has with people, even people who don't know the piece of music you're playing, when the trumpets raise their bells, there's something even ceremonial about when they raise their bells together, and they're pointed at the audience and they play something that just grabs you by the collar and you can't ignore it. And it makes you like it even more. And you definitely have that emotional connection. And I don't think there's an instrument in the band or the orchestra that is more immediately kind of connected in that way.
The sound of the trumpet is central to just about everything that we play and everything that we do. It's also one of the most iconic sounds that people can recognize of any age and of any sort of familiarity with music. A trumpet is really, really a standout sort of instrument. But more than that, it creates a series of different emotions. Some are commanding, and certainly in the military, we use the trumpet for all of those commanding calls where we hear a call and then we are supposed to stand up, or we're supposed to salute, or we're supposed to uh, be reverent, right? So it can be very commanding. It can also be very inviting. There are bugle calls that tell us it's time to eat. So that's a nice invitation to have. It's also a sound that can really help us to reflect. And I speak specifically of taps and that sacred call and those sacred notes that weigh on each of us as active duty, as veterans, as civilians, as just Americans in different ways, depending on how close we have been to fallen service men and women. And that versatility of that instrument, just within the scope of military calls, is incredibly impressive.
When you talk about the trumpet as a central musical instrument in the military, it certainly is. I mean, we as most people in the world will think of the trumpet and connecting it to military music in the way of bugle calls is probably the primary way people think of the trumpet. The solemn notes of taps that are so famous and so reverent and played all over the world. Reveille, or any of these famous calls that have made their way into popular culture or into the public consciousness. And of course, there are many more bugle calls than that have become central to kind of the function of the military, guiding troops and telling them either on the battlefield or in barracks where to go and what to do. And I don't think even people register that music is the central thing that is guiding our servicemen and women in uniform. That it seems like it's very functional, but it is very musical at the same time. And I think taps is probably the most beautiful example of something that is functional, but it's very reverent and very emotional as well.
Colonel Fettig spoke about taps, a very haunting melody that is played at the graveside of a military funeral, and also to honor veterans in our memory. As we celebrate veterans, each of us can honor the sacrifices of all of those who serve and have served and sacrificed for their country. We can also think about the veterans and servicemen and women we may know personally, and for many people, they need not look any farther than their own families to appreciate the dedication of those who have served in the armed forces. Several of my uncles were also United States Marines. My cousin, Craig Franklin, served as a 3-star general in the United States Air Force, and my Uncle Robert, where my middle name Robert comes from, served in the United States Army and was killed in 1945 in Africa at the end of World War II. These are the flags that were given to my grandmother at his funeral after this stirring melody of taps was played at his graveside. Most people never think about how we started using bugle calls. It had to happen sometime. You've seen images of the Revolutionary War, and back then you had the drum and the fife was like a little flute, and that signaled over great distances, but eventually the bugle call took over. I asked Colonel Timothy Foley to tell us more about that and the history of how the bugle was dominant finally, and how John Philip Sousa helped.
Fifes and drums are the oldest form of American military music. The drum, being a loud instrument, was used to beat calls for military formations, to signal commands in battle, and to beat the charge. In addition, the drum's rhythmic beat was used to regulate troops in the line of march. The fife was used together with the drum for indoor ceremonies and aboard ship. For instance, the tune Annie Laurie was used in the morning for morning colors, and the tune Old Lang Syne was used for retreat. Drums and fifes were the only musical instruments used by our American forces during and for many years after the Revolutionary War. In about 1875, the Army discontinued the use of fifes. This was due to the influence of more accurate and powerful firearms, which in turn changed the formation of troops from closed to extended lines in the field of battle. As it was increasingly difficult to control such organizations through the use of fifes or with the use of the voice, the louder and more clarion bugle was adopted to signal commands. In 1881, the Marine Corps also did away with the use of fifes and adopted the bugle in its place. The grizzled old fifers fought this change and tried to continue to use their fifes. A music school was established at Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C., for their instruction on the bugle, but they still protested, claiming that they had enlisted as fifers and not as buglers. Finally, the barracks commanding officer directed that no fifer would be permitted to re-enlist unless he learned to blow a bugle. Also based at the D.C. Marine Barracks at this time was the United States Marine Band, a musical organization of mixed instruments, woodwind, brass, and percussion, for the purpose of playing public concerts and parades. It fell to their newly appointed director, John Philip Sousa, to update the Marine Corps' field music repertoire. Sousa took to the task and began writing short pieces for regimental drums and bugles, or for the more modern-day relative of the bugle, the trumpet. By 1886, Sousa had diligently compiled his original field music pieces, and he compiled them into his first published book, which he titled The Trumpet and Drum. This was a pocket-sized manual containing training instructions for both the bugle and the drum, as well as a complete set of garrison signals and several original field marches. As time went by, Sousa wove these field pieces for the trumpet and the drum into marches that he had composed for performance by the Marine Band. Undoubtedly, the most famous of these marches is Semper Fidelis, composed in 1888. In the middle of this march, Sousa inserted his field march called With Steady Step, which was first printed in his trumpet and drum book.
All kinds of calls were written for the bugle, and they meant various things, as Major Nowlan described. One of these calls is To the Colors, and I'm going to play just a part of it for you now. And this was played, and still is played, when the flag is lowered at the end of the day. In the Chicago Symphony, we use the trumpet to play bugle calls, or things written like a bugle call. And the trumpet has something more than a bugle. If you've noticed, it has each of these. These are valves, and when you push the valve down, it adds tubing to the entire length of the instrument. And what that does is to make it possible for the instrument to play all the notes on the piano, the chromatic scale. And in doing that, we can play along in any key that the violins and the clarinets and any other chromatic instrument can perform. And composers wrote for the trumpet, still often in a style that sounded like a bugle, but it could be in a more complicated key than before. Composers like Beethoven wrote in one of his Leonore overtures a call which would have been played originally on the bugle, but for the trumpet. And everything comes to a stop, and this is what you hear. Another time when a trumpet sounds like a bugle in a symphony orchestra is within one of the trumpet parts Gustav Mahler wrote in his first symphony at the very beginning. Tchaikovsky also wrote for the trumpet sometimes like it was a bugle. He wrote a piece called Capriccio Italian, and in the beginning of this piece, he writes for the trumpet, but because of these valves, I can play in the key it's written, and here's what it sounds like. One of the most famous pieces written for the symphony orchestra is called Ein Heldenleben, written by Richard Strauss. He writes for the trumpet very much like a bugle, but he uses much more chromatic notes that couldn't have been played on a bugle, but it still sounds like a military fanfare. In the middle of the piece, there's a section called the battle scene, and in it, the trumpets play a call that sounds like this. There's another instrument that has valves like the trumpet, and that's the cornet. This is an old cornet from 1908, and it was actually used by the first trumpet player of the Chicago Symphony. His name was Otto Schubert. He played from 1907 to 1911. And the cornet had a huge part in the history of bands and military bands, but also in the symphony orchestra. The valves work just the same as on a trumpet. The fingerings are the same. And the sound is a little softer. It's more lyrical. And so beautiful melodies are often written for the cornet, but also very technical passages. Because how the instrument is built, it makes technical work much easier. I asked Colonel Fettig to tell us more about the cornet and where it fits inside of the band's sound.
The cornet, this variation of the trumpet, this conical bore instrument, which was sweeter than the trumpet. It could play some of the things that the trumpet did with that strength that we talked about and that kind of declamatory character, but it could also play sweetly. It could also play songs. It could play technical passages. It had like these two characters, and it was the perfect instrument to embed in the tradition of the band to capture all of those emotions. And it became a very famous solo instrument. Some of Sousa's most accomplished musicians and some of his most oft-featured soloists were cornet players. And there is this tremendous century-plus history and tradition of the cornet in bands and the cornet solo, and they are inextricably linked. The cornet has gone out of fashion in many ways. It's occasionally used in orchestra and occasionally used in university bands, but it's not nearly as present as it used to be. But the Marine Band still uses cornets. We go out of our way to preserve that tradition, not only as a nod to our history and our heritage and that kind of celebration of the music of the people, but also because it's such a fantastic instrument. It's such a beautiful timbre for the band. And I think it's one of the things that makes the band what it is, that makes the band as an artistic institution stand out and makes it that much more special.
And what's the difference between a cornet and a trumpet? Well, a trumpet wraps around once, and that's the entirety of the length of the instrument. On a cornet, if you look very carefully, it wraps around twice and goes out the bell. Now that helps the sound to be a little rounder and create the melodic quality that Colonel Fettig spoke about. And probably the most famous piece written for the cornet that uses both a lyrical melody and complicated technical variations is the Carnival of Venice. So I thought I'd just play a little of the melody for you, and I'm sure you recognize it. But remember, the cornet can also play very technical passages, and players became very famous if they could play faster. They were very competitive with one another. Seems strange that trumpet players would be competitive, but it turns out that's true. And they would take simple melodies like the Carnival of Venice and embellish them till they seemed almost impossible without a lot of practice. Here's how that melody sounds in a more complicated technical variation. The official march of the United States Marine Corps is Semper Fidelis, written by John Philip Sousa. In the middle, it uses a famous bugle call, also written by Sousa, called With Steady Step. And I asked Colonel Fettig and Major Nellen how it was created and to describe why it became so popular, and also to explain what is the meaning of the title. Here's what they had to say.
The motto of the Marine Corps is Semper Fidelis, and the fact that Sousa used that as his title is really kind of central to the Marine Corps ethos. It means always faithful. And it's interesting that the Marine Corps chose that as its title, not something about bravery or courage under fire, but faithfulness, because that really is what it's all about when you serve in any service, but certainly in the Marine Corps as we feel it. And I see this very, very plainly in the veterans that come to our performances and make an effort to come hear the Marine Band. Some of these folks only served a couple of years, whether it was in war or just in general. And some have served entire careers, 20 to 30 years. But that motto of Semper Fidelis, always faithful, is something that everyone has in common. This service, and it could have been 50 years ago, it gets into their DNA. They become a part of the Marine Corps. They become a part of their service, and the service becomes part of them, and they carry that with them for the rest of their lives. And this is what happens with Marines. Our good friend John Hagstrom being a prime among them, who went on to a very successful career as a classical trumpeter, of course, in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, but will always be a United States Marine, will always have that in his blood. Semper Fidelis is one of these classic marches because it starts out like a regular march with these melodies that are of Sousa's invention, and then the whole thing switches in the middle. And the central part of the march is a traditional bugle call, which in fact was a bugle call he wrote earlier in his career called With Steady Step that he borrowed and inserted into this Marine Corps march that really was embodying his love of the Marine Corps and of that military kind of strength.
This love of country, this love of people, this sense of patriotism, this sense of service, all of those things float out of the notes of his melodies, and they're inspiring.
And his bugle call is one of the best bugle calls you'll ever hear. And it's so good that he repeats it 3 times, and each time he adds another layer, almost like a cake, a military layer cake. And the woodwinds get to come in and play a little decoration on top of the bugles, and then the trombones get to come in and play a very strong counter line on top of the bugle. So you have all these things going on at once, and then he breaks into a final melody to finish up the march. And the way the Marine Band performs this march is designed, as was Sousa's intention, to draw attention to this very proud military tradition that is led by the bugle, led by the trumpets, led by the cornets. And so we actually have our cornet players, our trumpet players, march out front of the ensemble. They stand in a row as though they were in a ceremony, even when we're in concert. They raise their bugles up together in sync, and they play this bugle call, and it sounds like one bugler playing this beautiful call. We play this march probably more than any other march other than the Stars and Stripes Forever. And every time we play it, you get the most amazing reaction from the audience. the trumpets come out front and everyone starts to get wide-eyed, and not only are they enjoying this amazing music, but they're seeing something that stirs some emotion in them. And when those trumpets come up together in unison and those first notes come out, even if you've never heard the march before, you know immediately what's happening because of that familiarity with the trumpet and with the bugles, and just that kind of sense of, this is what this means, this is what it represents. It's instantaneous.
That famous bugle call that is heard in the middle and to the very end of Semper Fidelis is with steady step. And Sousa may have heard it on an instrument like this. As a matter of fact, it's not impossible. They would have heard this instrument because this was built in the 1880s by Moses Slater, a very famous American brass manufacturer. And I'd like to play for you to hear what that sounded like on this instrument. The power of music to move people and to bring them together at a concert is extraordinary. We see this at the Chicago Symphony, but of course it happens with the Marine Band too. I asked Major Nowlin and Colonel Fettig to share some of their experiences watching this.
When everybody leaves, they leave red, white, and blue. And it's What fascinates me is when people come in and they need to find their chair and they need to sit, and they're very focused on them and making sure that they're where they are. And by the end of the concert, it's almost like all of their energy is outward. It's to each other, it's to their neighbor, it's to their friends, it's to their family, it's to the veterans that were there. And when they leave, the din and the noise, just watching people interact and talk, they're leaving different than they entered. And the only thing that happened was a 90-minute concert by the Marine Band. That was the variable.
There's a very visceral connection that happens right out of the gate when someone hears a military band play, and certainly when they hear the President's Own Marine Band play. We feel that across the whole spectrum of our duties. We certainly feel it at Arlington National Cemetery when we are playing more ceremonial music and more religious music and those trumpet calls that are such a central part of that ceremony. And it happens at the White House with all of the ceremonial and concert type functions we provide there. And it happens in concert. One of the most beautiful things about our duty and our job is to watch those connections take place among people from completely disparate backgrounds. We as a military organization are certainly there to honor our veterans and remind them of their service and help them be nostalgic about their service. But we're also a publicly funded professional concert music ensemble. And so we're there to provide music for American citizens as well. And all of these people are often in the very same room when we perform. They're in the same community. In many cases, they're part of the same community, but they may not know each other. They might not really have anything to do with each other's lives. One of the most valuable and one of the most enjoyable parts of my service is introducing these people to each other through music.
I have the joy of being in the audiences towards the end of the concerts when I've watched this audience as we've pulled them along on this musical journey through some standard literature, through some familiar marches, maybe some music they may have not have heard before, to music that speaks very directly to them as Americans and as citizens. And we end our concert with these playing the hymns of the armed forces and playing Stars and Stripes Forever, God Bless America, sometimes America the Beautiful. And I watch over an hour and a half time, this crowd just seamlessly melt.
And we see this when we perform on tour. All of these veterans that come, I have met veterans who have served for 3 years in the Marine Corps in the 1970s, and they come to this concert and they don't look like a Marine anymore, but by golly, they are Marines in their heart. And when we get to the end of that concert and we play the Armed Forces medley and we end with the Marines hymn, these Marines who have not served for 50 years snap to attention to their feet as soon as that music happens. As soon as those trumpets start sounding the melody of the Marines hymn, they stand straight as an arrow as though they had just graduated from basic training and that they were on their first day on duty and they were scared, that they didn't know what was coming. Of course, it's not fear at that point. It is just pure pride. Pure faithfulness to the Marine Corps and to service. And it's something that is generated by the music. The music flips some switch in their brain that turns on that pride like a beacon, like a bright white light, immediately pushes them to their feet, and they stand there with pride. And then the audience, of course, around them is applauding and showing their appreciation. And I think that only amplifies just how important and how strong that emotion is. And that's why people keep coming back to military band concerts. That's why the military bands in our country have been around, in our case, for 222 years, because the music is the thing that helps light that fire. The music is the thing that keeps that fire burning for people after they serve, reminding them that they will always be a member of whatever service they were. Are you once a Marine, always a Marine?
As a member of the United States Marine Band, I remember so many concerts, just like the ones Colonel Fettig and Major Nallen have described, seeing veterans come to their feet and enjoy the memories and the pride they have in their service. And music is such a powerful tool to bring back memories and to honor those who have given for their country. I asked Colonel Timothy Foley about his strongest memory of seeing music bring audiences together at Marine Band concerts, and he shared with me his memory of the first national tour concert after the events of September 11th, 2001.
Of course, foremost in my mind was the emotions that were running very, very high in our country at this time. And it was vitally important that the music that the Marine Band presented in our concerts, which were 7 nights a week for 7 weeks during that time, that the music reached out to the audience and suited, I guess you would say, the mood that they were feeling at this time. Whether that mood would be sadness, confusion, anger, but I felt that the music at the President's Own had to really reflect and represent the state of our citizens in our country at that particular time. We embarked on our tour the 3rd week of October, not long after these attacks had happened. And our first tour performance was in a small high school gymnasium in West Virginia. As the Marine Band had taken the stage and I gave them the preparation to play the music that we always play at the beginning of all of our concerts, our national anthem, I then turned to face the audience and lead the audience in the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And at that point, the lights in the auditorium were raised to the point where all of us in the band could see the faces of the members of the audience. At that moment, it was really overwhelming, I would dare say, for all of us, because here were men, women, and children waving small American flags, tears streaming down their faces, and singing their hearts out to the Star-Spangled Banner. Frankly, music that if you perform over and over and over again, I would say that it's unavoidable that in some ways it becomes routine. But on that tour, the mood of the people that we performed for was coming together in a kind of, a national unity, a feeling of compassion and love for one another. It was just incredibly powerful. I've always felt that music, in a sense, is a kind of life-saving vessel in which we could pour our emotions that cannot be expressed maybe in any other way other than through music. And music returns back and reflects to us those emotions and the power of those emotions. And certainly at this time, the music, something as heard as often as our Star-Spangled Banner, carried with it this incredible power. It was an extremely cathartic and moving experience.
Military concert bands and the Chicago Symphony share a common mission, which is to bring people together with music, to connect with them, to transform them with the energy and the excellence of what we can do together. This energy is so wonderful to experience as an audience member, but also as a musician. Working together as musicians is very similar to working together as military service members. We all know what we have to do, and we have a high level that we must achieve. And we all have to work on our own to solve difficulties ahead of bringing our solutions together as a group. A great concert is the result of that work, just like a great military effort is the result of individuals working alone and then together. And Colonel Fettig and Major Nallen spoke at great length about that. And I want to share with you some of what they had to say.
There's this symbiotic relationship that must happen between people of a like mind in order to execute at the highest possible level. And the reason that can happen in the military and in a musical organization is because there is this deep commitment and focus to the mission. In our case, it's a musical mission. It's bringing this piece of music to fruition the way the composer intended, and doing it at an extremely high level. And then in addition to that, doing it emotionally and doing it spontaneously and feeling those emotions together and communicating them with precision. That is an incredibly difficult thing, and it cannot be done without teamwork and without people being tuned into each other's feelings and each other's intentions.
The more important moments, I would say, as performers are when we're contributing behind the scenes, when we are supporting, when we are lifting somebody else up so they can shine. And those themes are constant in every aspect of life. You know, that they're not just music specific. I think that one of our roles just as solid citizens is to be able to lift others up and to be able to encourage others.
I've come to acknowledge and appreciate and feel great about the fact that it is a gift, that the music is the thing that helps honor those who've given so much to our country, but also helps them feel good about that, helps them be nostalgic about that, helps bring up the positive feelings about what they've sacrificed and given, and helps put the difficult, challenging feelings into context.
To United States veterans, we thank you. We're grateful, and we're inspired by you. We're continually inspired by you. I feel like our work is to tell your story and to make sure that your story is heard. And as I get to meet veterans across this nation, I'm motivated to get your story heard. And we find our role as one of service to you, to tell your story, to share your thoughts, to make sure that your legacy is known and never forgotten.
Veterans are important in our lives, and we honor their memories and their sacrifices with music. So much music has been written to honor our veteran servicemen and women. Major Nallen's grandfathers were military service members too, and he's composed some music that honors their service. It's called Let Freedom Ring, and it expands on the melody of My Country 'Tis of Thee. When the melody comes to the part that says, Land where my fathers died, he explained to me how important that moment is for him.
And I chose the lyrics, Land where my fathers died, which speaks to me quite personally. And you think about what people and what families give to, to keep us safe, to keep us secure, but also to remind us that this is a place worth fighting for. These are ideals worth fighting for. And I think that's very, very special. So I specifically chose that lyric. I have 3 grandfathers that all served in the Second World War. And I'm very proud of that and very proud of them.
That's the power of music, the power to immediately connect emotionally with somebody, no matter what their background, whether it's deep in your core because you are someone who has served, or it's someone who watches other people serve, but you know what that means, you can see what that means, and you can feel it. And that connection is just incredible. And when you hear it live through music, there's nothing like it.
This music does bring us together to remind us what's worth fighting for. Its voice honors those who have served and those who have sacrificed. The trumpet is a part of that voice, and we hope you will use your voice to also say thank you to our veterans who have served and who continue to serve. We hope you've enjoyed this program, and on behalf of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, we thank our very special guests, Colonel Timothy Foley, Colonel Jason Fettig, and Major Ryan Nowlin from the President's own United States Marine Band. Thanks also to the Tawani Foundation and to Colonel Jennifer N. Pritzker for their support to make this presentation possible. Thank you.